On a Tuesday morning in October of 1994, Frank Hartwell stood at the edge of an Ohio riverbank and watched his reputation sink into the mud. 2 days earlier, his company's newest excavator, a $580,000 Caterpillar 375, the most advanced machine his crew had ever operated, had broken through what the geotechnical survey said was consolidated riverbank material. The machine had dropped without warning, its 68 tons punching through a thin clay cap into the saturated silt beneath. Now it sat in the mud like a stranded ship, buried to its cab, only the upper boom and the top of the operator's station visible above the surface. Every hour, it seemed to settle a little deeper. Frank had tried everything his industry knew how to try. On the first day, he'd brought in two of his own heavy recovery trucks, modern 50-ton winches, synthetic rope rated for loads that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. They'd anchored to a concrete abutment half a mile back, engaged the winches at full power, and watched the rope go bar-tight until it sang like a piano wire. The excavator hadn't moved. The anchoring point had failed first, a block of concrete the size of a refrigerator pulling clean out of the ground, and the rope had gone slack with a whip-crack sound that made everyone flinch. On the second day, he'd called in a specialist recovery firm from Cincinnati. They'd driven 4 hours with their biggest equipment, a rotator capable of 300 tons of lifting force, a ground anchor system that was supposed to hold anything. They'd set up, engaged, and watched their own anchor system fail in the river silt. The specialist in charge had looked at the conditions and said something that Frank hadn't heard from a professional before. "There's nothing in our fleet that can get traction in this material. I've never seen mud this deep with this kind of suction. If you want my honest advice, wait for it to dry out." "That's 6 weeks minimum," Frank said. "I know, I'm sorry." A helicopter crane was discussed and dismissed. The machine was too deep in the mud for rigging, and the lift capacity required would cost more than the excavator was worth. A specialist diving crew could rig it, theoretically, but the river mud was essentially zero visibility, making the work dangerous to the point of recklessness. Frank was losing $15,000 a day in project delays. His insurance carrier was already asking uncomfortable questions about the geotechnical report. His crew was demoralized. His project manager had stopped making suggestions because none of them worked. That's when the old Ford pickup came down the access road. Now let me tell you about Walt Briggs, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Walt was 71 years old and had been running Briggs Recovery out of a farm property near Gallipolis, Ohio, for 32 years. His operation was not impressive by any modern standard. A converted barn for a garage, 3 trucks, 2 full-time employees who were both over 50, and a reputation that didn't extend much beyond the lower Ohio River Valley. What Walt had was knowledge, the deep, specific, patient kind of knowledge that comes from spending 30 years pulling things out of situations that shouldn't have happened in the first place. He'd grown up watching his father Earl work the river. Earl Briggs had run a recovery operation along the Ohio from the 1930s through the 1960s, back when the river was still the primary artery for heavy industry in the region, when barges ran 24 hours, and the banks were lined with steel mills and chemical plants and the equipment that served them. Earl had seen everything that could go wrong with heavy machinery along a river and had developed methods for dealing with most of it. When Earl retired in 1962, he'd left Walt 3 things: the property, the tools, and the 1949 Holmes 750 wrecker that had been the centerpiece of Briggs' recovery since the Truman administration. The Holmes 750 was built in 1949 by the Ernest Holmes Company of Chattanooga, Tennessee, the firm that had essentially invented the tow truck as a category of vehicle. The 750 was their heavy-duty model, designed for serious recovery work, overturned semis, derailed equipment, vehicles that had gone over embankments. It rode on a heavy-duty truck chassis modified by Holmes to carry the dual-boom recovery system that was the machine's signature feature. Two booms instead of one, that was the key. Every modern wrecker used a single main boom, a single point of lift or pull, applied through a single axis. The Holmes 750 used two independent booms that could be angled to apply force from slightly different directions simultaneously. The practical result was that it could apply torque to a stuck load, not just straight-line pull, but a twisting, working force that loosened mud's grip the way you'd work a stuck jar lid rather than just pulling straight up on it. Modern wreckers were faster, more powerful on paper, and far more capable for straightforward jobs. But the Holmes 750 could do something they couldn't: apply sustained, variable direction force to a load that was truly embedded in soft ground. Walt had learned this from Earl, who had learned it from his own experience, and from the Holmes Company representatives who'd trained him when the truck was new. By 1994, Walt was one of maybe a dozen operators left in the entire country who truly understood the dual-boom system. Everyone else had moved to single-boom rotators and hydraulic winches. The old techniques had died with the men who developed them. Walt had watched the situation on the river bank for 2 days before he drove down to the site. He'd seen the recovery trucks fail. He'd seen the specialist firm fail. He'd watched from his property on the ridge above the river, drinking coffee and thinking about what his father would have done, and he'd known the answer almost from the first hour. He loaded the Holmes 750 on his transport trailer, drove down the access road, and introduced himself to Frank Hartwell. "Morning." Frank glanced at him, old man, old truck, worn work clothes. "Morning, sites restricted. Who are you?" "Walt Briggs, Briggs Recovery up on Route 7. I've been watching your situation for 2 days. He nodded toward the buried excavator. "I think I can get it out." The engineers who were standing with Frank exchanged glances. Someone coughed. A site worker who'd been listening from 20 feet away started grinning. Frank looked at the truck on the trailer, the old red and white paint, the bulky twin booms, the BRIGGS recovery lettering on the door, and then he looked at Walt. And he laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, not at first. It was the laugh of a man who's been under pressure for 2 days and is suddenly presented with something so incongruous that it short-circuits his usual filters. A 71-year-old man and a truck from 1949, showing up to do what the best modern recovery equipment in Cincinnati couldn't. "With that," Frank said, pointing at the Holmes 750. "With that," Walt said. The laughter spread. One of the engineers was shaking his head. A foreman nearby said something to the worker beside him, and they both smiled. "Sir," Frank said, composing himself, "I appreciate you coming down. I really do. But we've had 2 modern 50-ton winches fail. We've had a specialist firm with a 300-ton rotator fail. My insurance carrier is already involved. I cannot put a 45-year-old wrecker anywhere near that excavator." "What does a 50-ton winch do when it's pulling straight back against 68 tons of mud suction?" Frank paused. "It pulls. It pulls and it fails because you're fighting the suction directly. You're trying to overcome it with raw force. That machine down there isn't being held by weight, it's being held by vacuum. The mud around it has created a pressure differential. The harder you pull straight out, the more the mud seals around it." Frank crossed his arms. "And your 45-year-old truck does what exactly that my equipment can't?" "It breaks the seal instead of fighting it. 2 booms, offset angles. I put one boom pulling at about 15 degrees right of center and the other at 15 degrees left. The load gets a rotational force applied to it. It's worked back and forth rather than just yanked. The mud can't maintain its seal against a load that's moving in 3 dimensions." One of the engineers had stopped smiling. He was listening now. Frank looked at the engineer. The engineer looked at the Homer, then back at Frank. "I'm not charging you," Walt said. If it doesn't work, you've lost an hour. If it does work, you make a donation to the Ohio Valley Historic Vehicle Association. They've been helping me keep that truck running for 30 years. Frank looked at the Holmes 750 for a long moment, then at the excavator still sinking, then at the specialist firm's truck parked uselessly at the top of the bank. "Fine," he said, "but if that thing gets anywhere near the water and starts to slip, we abort immediately. I'm not losing two machines." "She won't slip," Walt said. "I've had her in worse." He climbed back into his pickup and drove up the access road to get the Holmes 750. Now let me tell you about the Holmes 750, because it's the real reason this story happened. The Ernest Holmes Company had been building recovery equipment since 1916, when Ernest Holmes himself invented the first practical tow truck after watching a man spend 8 hours and the help of 6 friends pulling a car out of a ditch with block and tackle and fence rails. Holmes thought there had to be a better way. By 1949, the company had 30 years of experience building equipment specifically for the hardest recovery jobs, not the routine fender-bender tows, but the situations where something very heavy was somewhere it had absolutely no business being. The Model 750 was their answer to the question of what to do when a standard single-boom wrecker wasn't enough. The dual-boom system had been developed based on feedback from operators who'd encountered exactly the kind of situation Walt was now facing: loads embedded in soft ground, surrounded by material that created suction and resistance in every direction. The key insight was simple: a load embedded in mud isn't just heavy, it's anchored. The mud around it has conformed to its shape and created a seal. Pulling straight out doesn't break the seal, it just adds tensile stress to whatever is pulling. The seal gives way when the load moves in a direction perpendicular to the seal surface, which is what rotational force achieves. Earl Briggs had understood this intuitively after 20 years of experience. The Holmes Company had understood it from engineering. The result was the 750's dual-boom system, which allowed an operator to apply exactly this kind of compound, multi-directional force. Modern recovery equipment was more powerful, but it applied that power in one direction. The Holmes 750 applied force the way a skilled mechanic loosens a stuck bolt, not with brute force, but with the right technique applied steadily. Walt had learned the technique from Earl. Earl had learned it from the Holmes Company representative who trained him when the truck was new. The knowledge had passed from man to man like a craft, and now Walt was one of the last people on the Ohio River who still had it. It took him 45 minutes to position the Holmes 750. He drove it down the bank access road as far as the ground condition allowed, closer to the river than the modern equipment had dared to go. Because he understood the soil the way a farmer understands weather, from long experience rather than instruments. He set his own ground anchors, driving them at angles his father had taught him, angles that distributed the load through undisturbed soil beneath the soft surface layer. Then he got the recovery chains. Not cables, chains. The Holmes 750 used chain rather than wire rope because chain had a different failure mode. It didn't snap under shock loading the way cable did. It stretched and warned you before it let go. Walt's chains were old, heavy, forged steel with links as thick as a finger. They'd been on the truck since Earl bought it. He waded into the mud. The construction crew watched in silence as the old man walked into the river silt, mud to his thighs within the first few steps, moving slowly and deliberately, reading the ground beneath him the way you read ice before you trust your weight to it. He could feel the solid substrate through his boots, 4 feet beneath the surface. Soft on top but firm underneath. The truck would hold. It took 20 minutes to reach the excavator and attach the chains. Walt tested each connection 3 times. By the time he waded back to solid ground, he was mud to his shoulders. Frank Hartwell was watching from the bank. The mockery was completely gone from his face. "You sure about this?" Frank called out. Been doing this since before your company existed, Walt said. Stand back from the chains. He climbed up to the home's 750's controls. Not a modern enclosed cab with digital readouts, but an open operator's station with analog gauges and mechanical levers that had been built when mechanics still understood what everything they were operating actually did. He engaged the left boom winch, brought it to tension, felt the resistance in the lever. Then the right boom winch, offset at his calculated angle. The chains went taut at different tensions. The first physical law of the dual boom system. When two forces are applied to a load from different angles, the resultant force passes through neither of the individual vectors. The excavator would feel a force pulling it in a direction neither chain was actually pointed. Walt held the dual tension for 30 seconds. The excavator didn't move. The mud didn't yield. This was expected. He reduced the left winch tension by about 20%, increased the right. The load began to rotate microscopically, invisibly to anyone watching, but Walt could feel it in the controls. The mud's grip was no longer symmetric around the load. He reversed the adjustment. Left winch up, right winch down. The load rotated back. He could feel something changing in the resistance. Back and forth. Not yanking. Not surging. Working the load the way you'd work a fence post that's been in the ground for 30 years, patient, rhythmic, letting the ground tire of holding before you try to take the weight. 3 minutes of this. Then Walt engaged both booms simultaneously, both at full tension. The excavator moved. 1 inch, 2 inches. The mud made a sound, a deep, resonant, sucking groan that everyone on the bank felt more than heard, and the seal broke. Once the seal broke, it was physics. The excavator came forward 4 inches on the first sustained pull, then 8, then a foot. Walt worked the controls with the attention of someone performing surgery, not more force than needed, not less, keeping the rotational component active to prevent the mud from resealing. The construction crew had stopped talking. They were just watching. 10 feet of movement, 20. The tracks emerged from the mud, black and dripping, trailing gray silt that dissolved back into the river. 30 feet. The excavator was on firmer ground. Walt kept pulling 100 feet until the machine was clear of the soft zone entirely and sitting on packed gravel. He closed both winch valves, set the brake, climbed down from the operator's station. The construction crew erupted. Men were cheering, some of them shaking hands with each other, 2 of them actually embracing. The engineer who'd stopped smiling during Walt's explanation was now standing with his mouth open, looking at the home's 750 the way you look at something that's just violated your understanding of how the world works. Frank Hartwell stood completely still. He looked at the excavator, his $580,000 machine, sitting on solid ground, muddy but intact. He looked at the home's 750, 45 years old, dual booms still extended, chains dripping Ohio River mud. He looked at Walt Briggs, covered in mud to his shoulders, moving slowly back to the truck to begin recovering his chains. Frank walked over. "Mr. Briggs." "Mr. Hartwell." "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Get your equipment out of here before the river comes up." Frank followed him to the truck. Walt was already recoiling the chains, methodical, the same way he'd done it 10,000 times before. "How did you know it would work?" Walt didn't look up from the chains. "I didn't know for certain, but I knew the physics were right. The dual boom principle works because it applies force the way the load needs to be freed, not the way it's most convenient for the equipment. Your machines are powerful, but they're built to apply power in one direction. This load needed to be worked loose, not ripped out." "Where did you learn that?" "My father. He learned it from the Holmes Company when they sold him the truck in 1951. He spent 20 years on this river pulling things out of the mud. He taught me what he knew. And no one else knows this technique." Walt finally looked up. His expression wasn't proud. It was something more like sad. There were maybe 30 operators in the country who really understood the dual boom system when my father was young. Most of them are dead. The companies that trained them are gone. The trucks are in museums, the few that weren't scrapped. He went back to the chains. Modern equipment is better for most jobs. Faster, more capable, easier to operate. But there are situations, specific situations, where the old methods work and the new ones don't. The problem is nobody remembers the old methods anymore. Frank was quiet for a moment. How much do I owe you? What I said. A donation to the Historic Vehicle Association. Whatever you think is fair. They helped you maintain the truck. For 15 years. Parts are impossible to find. They've helped me track them down, helped me find retired mechanics who remember how things like this are supposed to work. Walt straightened up and looked at Frank. If they hadn't existed, this truck would have been scrapped 10 years ago, and you'd still be staring at your excavator in the mud. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook. He wrote $15,000, what he estimated one day of delays had cost, and handed it to Walt without hesitation. That's more than. It's what it's worth, Frank said, and my personal apology for laughing at you. That wasn't right. Walt looked at the check, folded it, put it in his shirt pocket. People laugh at old things, it's natural. The mistake is assuming that old means useless. Frank looked at the home 750, the faded paint, the mechanical levers, the dual booms that were older than some of his crew members. I spent 20 years building the most capable recovery operation in this region, he said. I have trucks that cost more than most people's houses, and an old man with a 45-year-old wrecker just did something none of them could do. Your trucks are better than mine for 95% of jobs, Walt said. I've seen them work. I wouldn't want to do most of what you do with my equipment, but that 5%, that 5% nearly cost me my business today. That 5% is why I still run this truck. Walt climbed into the cab of the home 750 to drive it back up the bank. He paused, one hand on the frame. Mr. Hartwell, if you ever have another situation like this one, something truly embedded in soft ground, something where straight-line force isn't working, call me before you call the specialists. I'm not saying I can always help, but I can usually tell you in 10 minutes whether the dual boom principle applies. Might save you 2 days next time. Frank nodded. I'll do that. Walt drove the home 750 up the bank, moving at a measured pace, the dual booms folded back for travel, the chains properly stowed. Frank watched him go and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, not just gratitude, but something closer to humility. The kind that comes when you realize your expertise has limits you didn't know were there. Now let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end at the river bank. Walt Briggs became, very briefly, something he'd never wanted to be, famous. Frank Hartwell talked. He told the story at his company's annual meeting. He told it to other contractors at industry conferences. He told it to a reporter from a regional engineering journal who wrote a piece about it. The first time the dual boom recovery technique had appeared in print in over 20 years. Calls started coming to the farm in Gallipoli. Other contractors who'd had equipment stuck in impossible places. Recovery companies who'd heard the story and wanted to understand the technique. A historian from the home's company's successor organization who was documenting the history of their equipment. 2 engineering professors from Ohio State who wanted to discuss the physics. Walt talked to all of them. He explained the dual boom principle patiently, the same way his father had explained it to him. He demonstrated the technique at the Ohio Valley Historic Vehicle Association's annual show, staging a mock recovery with the home's 750 that drew the largest crowd in the show's history. He was careful to say, every time, that he wasn't claiming the old ways were better. He was claiming they were different, and that different mattered in specific situations. Modern equipment is better for 95% of jobs, he told the engineering professors. I'd be foolish to argue otherwise. But that 5%, those specific situations where soft ground and suction and multidirectional force are all in play, that 5% is where the old knowledge still has something to offer. And if nobody keeps the knowledge alive, it disappears. And then when you need it, it's gone. The professors included that quote in a paper they published. It was the first academic documentation of the dual boom recovery technique in 4 decades. Over the next 8 years, Walt trained 11 other operators in the dual boom system, mostly younger men who ran historic vehicles and were interested in the technique as part of their appreciation for the machines. He wrote a manual, 42 pages, hand-typed, that described the technique in enough detail that a skilled mechanic could understand and apply it. He made 20 copies and sent them to libraries and archives and the Ohio Valley Historic Vehicle Association. The 11th person he trained was his son Danny. Danny Briggs was 43 in 2002 when Walt finally decided he was too old for the river work. Walt's knees had been giving him trouble for years, the kind of trouble that comes from decades of wadding through mud and climbing on and off heavy equipment. His doctor had been telling him for 2 years to stop. He kept the Holmes 750. Of course he kept the Holmes 750. Danny had grown up around that truck the same way Walt had grown up around Earl's equipment. It was as much a part of the Briggs family as the farm property it lived on. The day Walt formally handed the truck over to Danny, no ceremony, no paperwork, just a conversation in the garage, was a Thursday morning in April. Danny had been doing the annual maintenance check on the booms. Walt walked in, watched for a while, and then handed him the original 1951 Holmes operating manual that Earl had kept in the cab for 30 years. "Your grandfather's notes are in the margins," Walt said. "Some of mine too. Read them before you need them." Danny looked at the manual, looked at his father. "What if I get in a situation I don't know how to handle?" "You'll know more than you think you do," Walt said. "And the truck knows the rest. Trust the physics." Walt Briggs died in 2008. He was 85 years old. Congestive heart failure, the way these things usually go, in the hospital in Gallipolis with Danny beside him, and the window facing west toward the river. The funeral was small. Walt had never been famous in any lasting sense, and the people who'd known him best were mostly gone. Frank Hartwell came. He'd stayed in touch since 1994, calling occasionally with questions about equipment and conditions. He told the story of the riverbank recovery at the service, the same story he'd been telling for 14 years, and it still got the same reaction it always had. Danny Briggs still runs the Holmes 750. It's 65 years old now, and it runs because Danny has maintained it with the same patience his father and grandfather brought to everything mechanical. He's had to fabricate parts that no longer exist. He's had to track down retired machinists who remember specifications from manuals that are out of print. He's become, without particularly intending to, one of the leading experts on post-war Holmes recovery equipment in the country. He's used the dual boom technique 7 times in 20 years. 7 situations where modern equipment couldn't get the job done, and the Holmes 750 could. 7 machines that would otherwise still be in the mud. Frank Hartwell's grandson called Danny in 2019. He'd taken over the company and gotten an excavator stuck in almost exactly the same river silt situation his grandfather had faced in 1994. Danny listened to the description and said the same thing Walt had said to Frank 25 years earlier. "I think I can get it out." He drove down to the site. The young project manager, 29, 3 years out of engineering school, saw the Holmes 750 coming down the access road and started to say something that had a skeptical edge to it. Then he saw the name on the door, Briggs Recovery. "Is that the same truck?" he asked Danny. Same truck. My grandfather told me about this truck, said it was the only thing that ever got him out of a situation he'd given up on. That's right. He said the old man who drove it was the most competent person he'd ever watched work. Danny climbed out and started assessing the site. I'll tell him you said so next time I visit the cemetery. The recovery took 4 hours. The dual booms, the chains, the patient application of rotational force. The same technique Walt had learned from Earl, who had learned it from Holmes, who had developed it from 30 years of watching what worked and what didn't. The excavator came out. The young project manager watched the entire process without speaking. When it was done, when the Holmes 750 was recoiling its chains and the excavator was on solid ground, he walked over to Danny. How do you know how to do that? My father taught me, his father taught him. Is there a manual? There's 42 pages of one, handwritten in 2003. I can send you a copy. The project manager looked at the Holmes 750, the faded paint, the mechanical simplicity, the dual booms that his grandfather had once watched save a machine worth more than most houses. Why does it still work when the modern equipment couldn't? Danny started walking back toward the truck. He gave the same answer Walt had given, and Walt had given before him, and Earl had given before that. Because it applies force the way the problem needs it, not the way the equipment finds it most convenient. Understanding the difference is 30 years of experience. Having the equipment to act on it is 65 years of maintenance. He climbed into the cab. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for someone to remember why they were built. He drove the Holmes 750 back up the bank, moving at a measured pace, the same pace Walt had always kept, the pace that comes from respecting a machine that has never once been pushed harder than necessary. The project manager stood at the river's edge watching until the truck was out of sight. Somewhere in Gallipolis, Ohio, in a converted barn on a property that has been in the Briggs family since 1932, a 1949 Holmes 750 wrecker sits waiting. Its booms are in perfect alignment. Its chains are properly stowed. Its gauges are accurate. Its dual boom system works exactly the way it was designed to work in 1949. It's been there for 75 years. And every time someone says that thing is too old to matter anymore, the Briggs family fires it up, drives it to the site, and proves them wrong. That's what happens when you keep the knowledge alive. That's what happens when a machine is maintained by people who understand what it was built for. That's what happens when you don't throw away the old ways just because the new ones are shinier. The engineer said nothing could pull it out. The old man fired up his 1949 wrecker. And the excavator came out of the mud,